Welcome to the deep dive. We love to dig into those complicated topics and pull out all the interesting stuff. We're going to be doing a deep dive today on cloud migration. We found a really interesting conversation on a tech forum. Basically, some company decided to migrate 8 data centers, all 8, over to AWS.
8 data centers? Wow, that's a big change.
Yeah, it is. And it kind of got me thinking about the whole cloud migration thing. Everyone else is talking about how it saves money and makes things more efficient, but is it really all it's cracked up to be? What are the real costs, beyond those sweet deals cloud providers dangle in front of you? And what happens to your IT team? Those folks with all the on-premise skills. That's what we're going to unpack today.
Oh, yeah, and we got to talk about vendor lock-in. You know that whole thing, like those teaser rate mortgages. You could get stuck with a cloud provider that ends up costing you way more down the line.
Exactly. Okay, so let's start with the why. Why are so many companies moving to the cloud in the first place?
Well, there are a few things happening. First, those on-premise solutions are getting more expensive. Have you seen what Broadcom's been doing with their prices? Oof.
Yeah.
It's enough to make anyone consider the cloud. Then you got the cloud providers themselves. They're offering all these crazy deals, like free migration, they'll take over your hardware leases, even free hosting for a while.
Oh, yeah. The company in our forum discussion, the one moving to AWS, they got a pretty amazing package deal. Free migration, AWS bought out their hardware leases, and then 2 years of free hosting. I mean, come on.
Yeah, I know, right? Sounds pretty tempting. But you got to think long term. Those cost projections, they can be kind of, fuzzy. Sometimes you don't see the whole financial picture until you're already committed.
Yeah, it's kind of like those teaser rate mortgages. Everything looks amazing at first, but then, bam, those interest rates go through the roof. And once you're in a cloud ecosystem, it's really hard to get out, really expensive.
Exactly. Vendor lock-in, it's a real concern. You've got your applications, your whole workflow, all set up for that specific cloud provider. Try switching to a different platform or going back on premise, and you're looking at a logistical nightmare. Plus, it'll cost you an arm and a leg.
Yeah, it's like you built your house on someone else's land. You don't control the foundation, and if you want to move, well, get ready to pay some serious moving fees.
Perfect analogy. So yeah, before you jump headfirst into the cloud, you got to really think about your needs, long term, and what risks you're willing to take.
Okay, so let's say a company decides to go for it. How do they actually do the migration?
Well, a lot of companies use what's called lift and shift. Basically, they just take their applications and move them to the cloud just as they are.
So they just pick everything up and plop it down in the cloud. What could go wrong, right?
Yeah. Well, the problem is they're missing out on all the cool stuff the cloud can do. It's like buying a fancy sports car and only driving it in first gear. You're paying for all that horsepower, but not using it.
So you're basically running your old on-premise setup on a cloud platform, which could end up costing you more and being less efficient.
You got it. That's why sometimes companies end up doing what's called a cloud back migration. They jump into the cloud all excited about those initial promises and then realize it's not what they expected. So they move back on premise. We saw a bunch of stories like that in the forum discussion, companies that were like, ugh, I wish we hadn't done that.
Yeah, it sounds like you really got to plan things out and understand how cloud architecture works before you make the leap.
No doubt. You need to analyze your applications, see how you can optimize them for the cloud, and pick the right cloud services. Otherwise, you're just wasting time and money.
Okay, let's talk about the people involved in all of this. This is a huge tech shift, and it can have a big impact on IT professionals. What happens to those folks who know all about on-premise systems? What happens to their skills?
Yeah, that's a really important question. The guy who started the forum thread, he's worried about his coworkers. They're all experts in VMware. They've spent years learning it, and now the company's moving to AWS. That's a whole different set of skills.
So their expertise, it kind of just disappears.
Well, it's not useless, but they definitely need to adapt. The IT world is always changing. Cloud migration is just one example of how those changes can affect people's careers.
So what can those IT folks do? Are they just out of luck? Or can they learn new stuff and keep growing in their careers?
It's a bit of both. Cloud migration can actually create new opportunities. Learning cloud technologies like containers or microservices is really valuable in today's job market. But some companies, they just outsource the whole migration process, and their IT staff gets left out in the cold.
And that can make people feel like they're being left behind. Their skills aren't needed, and they're not part of this big tech change happening in their company. That's got to be tough.
It is. It's super important for companies to consider the human side of cloud migration. They need to provide training, help their employees learn new skills, and get them involved in the process. That way, the transition is smoother, and it shows employees that their skills and experience are valued.
Yeah, it's about creating a culture of learning, right?
Yeah.
Recognizing that tech keeps changing and everyone needs to adapt.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about financial incentives, tech challenges, and the impact on people's careers. Let's zoom out for a minute and look at the bigger picture. We mentioned those rising vendor prices, especially from Broadcom. How does that fit into all of this cloud migration stuff?
Broadcom raising their prices for VMware. That's a big reason why companies are jumping to the cloud. Actually, it was the main reason for the company in our forum discussion. They're not alone, though. A lot of companies are feeling squeezed by those on-premise costs, and the cloud seems like the answer.
So Broadcom is kind of pushing companies toward the cloud without even meaning to.
You could say that. It's causing a ripple effect across the whole industry. And it's not just Broadcom. As more businesses move to the cloud, hardware and software vendors are going to have to adapt. Those that depend on on-premise solutions might get left behind.
It's like this evolutionary pressure pushing the entire tech world towards a cloud-centric future. But is that necessarily a good thing? Are there any downsides?
That's the big question. The cloud has a lot of advantages, but it's not perfect. We already talked about vendor lock-in and those hidden costs, but there's more to consider.
Like what? Tell me the secrets. What other pitfalls are lurking out there?
For one, security and data privacy become even more important in the cloud. You're trusting a third party with your data, so you got to be sure they're keeping it safe.
Basically handing over your digital crown jewels.
Exactly. And then there's compliance. Different industries have different rules about data storage. You have to make sure the cloud provider you choose follows those rules.
It sounds like migrating to the cloud isn't a simple yes or no decision. It's not just about saving money or making things more efficient.
You got it. It's a big decision with long-term consequences. You got to weigh the costs and benefits and think about the risks before you jump in.
Well, I think we've covered a lot in this first part of our cloud migration deep dive. We talked about money, we talked about the tech stuff, we talked about what happens to IT folks, and how all of this is changing the tech world. But there's more to come.
Oh, yeah. Stay tuned for part 2. We'll be talking about strategies for successful cloud migration. Like, what are some different approaches, and what advice do we have for companies that are thinking about making the move?
It's going to be good. Don't go anywhere. All right, welcome back to the deep dive. So we just spent some time talking about, well, all the tricky stuff with cloud migration. Now let's get down to brass tacks. What can companies actually do to make this whole thing work?
Yeah, let's talk strategy.
Okay, so say a company's decided, yep, we're going to the cloud. What are the big things they need to think about?
First off, don't put all your eggs in one basket. If you only use one cloud provider, you could get stuck. Not much wiggle room later on.
So like, don't just jump into AWS or Azure without checking out what else is out there.
Right. Think about a multi-cloud approach. Spread your stuff across different providers.
So some things go to AWS, other things go to Google Cloud, like that.
Exactly. That way you're not at the mercy of just one vendor. Gives you more leverage, and it's less risky.
Makes sense. Kind of like diversifying your investments,
Yeah.
right? Spread the risk.
Yeah, good analogy. Another thing is, don't just focus on the initial migration, like getting everything moved over as fast as possible. Think long term.
So it's not just about the destination, it's the journey.
You got it. You need a plan.
Hmm?
How's your cloud setup going to change over time? How are you going to manage costs? What happens when your business needs change?
And what about the people doing all this work? We talked about how IT professionals need to learn new skills.
Oh, yeah, super important. Invest in your people, give them training, help them adapt. That's key for a successful migration.
So make your current team into cloud experts instead of just hiring outside help.
Exactly. Smoother transition, happier employees, and it shows you value their skills.
Yeah, happy employees, productive employees, right?
Absolutely. Here's another one that people forget. Egress costs.
Egress costs. What's that?
It's what cloud providers charge you to move data out of their system.
Oh, so like if you want to move some data back on premise or to a different cloud?
Yep. And those fees can add up quick, so plan for them.
Gotcha. It's like a hidden toll on the cloud highway.
Haha, yeah. Oh, and here's another tip from our forum discussion. Think about cloud-native solutions.
Cloud native. Does that mean building applications specifically for the cloud?
Well, it could, but it's more about using those cloud principles,
Hmm.
scalability, flexibility, automation. Cloud-native solutions, they're designed to take advantage of what the cloud does best.
So instead of just moving your old applications over, you're redesigning them to work perfectly in the cloud.
Exactly. You might use things like containers, microservices, serverless computing, stuff like that.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. Cloud migration isn't just about changing locations. It's about changing how you think about your whole IT setup.
Absolutely. It's a whole new way of doing things.
So to recap, we've got multi-cloud strategies, long-term planning, making sure employees get the training they need, factoring in those egress costs, and going cloud native.
Yep, that's the gist. Oh, and one more thing, don't be afraid to get some help.
Ah, the consulting card.
Aha. But seriously, good cloud consultants can be super valuable. They can assess your needs, help you come up with a migration plan, and guide you through all the cloud craziness.
So like a Sherpa guiding you through the treacherous mountain passes of cloud migration.
Exactly. They can help you avoid those expensive mistakes, make sure your cloud setup is running smoothly, and make the transition easier for everyone.
I think we've given our listeners a lot to chew on. Cloud migration, it's exciting, it's got tons of potential, but it's also complicated.
Yeah, for sure. It's a big decision.
Okay, let's shift gears for a bit. And the last part of our deep dive, we'll be taking a look at the big picture.
We're going to be talking about how cloud migration is shaping the future of business and tech.
Don't miss it. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into cloud migration. So we've talked about the money, the techie stuff, how this affects IT people. Now, let's zoom out even more.
Yeah, let's look at the big picture. Like, what does all this mean for the future of business and tech?
Okay, so we know more and more companies are moving to the cloud. What's next?
Well, I think that trend's going to keep accelerating. Once companies see how beneficial cloud computing can be, everyone's going to want to get in on the action.
Like a domino effect.
Exactly. And that's going to have a huge impact on the entire tech industry. We'll see even more cloud solutions popping up, new business models, maybe even a shift in who the big players are.
So the cloud isn't going anywhere, it's changing everything. How can companies keep up with all these changes? How can they thrive in this cloud-centric world?
2 words: agility and flexibility. Those old school on-premise IT systems, they're on their way out. Companies need to be able to adapt quickly.
Adapt to what?
Everything. Changing markets, new technologies, you name it. The cloud gives you the tools to do that.
So like you can scale your resources up or down whenever you need to.
Yep. You can experiment with new tech, respond quickly to customers. It's a whole different ballgame.
It's like having a super flexible IT system that can change with your needs.
That's a great way to put it. And that flexibility leads to innovation. Companies that can really utilize the cloud, they can create new products, reach new markets, and basically dominate.
So the cloud isn't just about saving money or being more efficient. It's about unlocking potential, being creative, and pushing the boundaries.
Absolutely. And that brings us to something we've talked about before: talent.
People, yeah, always important.
As more and more things move to the cloud, the demand for people who know how to work with it is going to explode. Companies need to start training their employees now.
Otherwise, they'll be scrambling to find qualified people.
Oh, yeah, it's already happening.
Yeah.
Companies that can attract and keep those cloud experts, they're going to have a big advantage.
Okay, any final thoughts for our listeners before we wrap up?
Just remember, the cloud's not a destination, it's a journey.
Meaning, you don't just migrate and you're done.
Right. You're constantly adapting, optimizing, evolving. The cloud world is always changing. New technologies, new best practices. Companies need to stay up to date, keep learning, and be ready to pivot.
So it's like sailing a ship through uncharted waters, constantly adjusting to the wind.
Perfect analogy. The companies that embrace that journey, with curiosity, flexibility, and a long-term vision, those are the ones that are going to succeed.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. The promises of cloud migration, the potential pitfalls, the impact it's having on the world.
I hope our listeners have a better grasp of this whole cloud thing now.
It's definitely been a fascinating journey for me. I can't wait to see what the future holds.
Me too. The key is to keep learning, keep asking questions, keep exploring.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time, stay curious.